This morning, we're continuing this series that we've been doing on women of the Bible. And we'll do this for another few weeks in the run-up to Easter. There are a lot of women in the Bible, which is a good thing. So we've got a multitude to draw on in this series. But this week, we're going to dip into the rarely read Old Testament book of Numbers. Numbers. So if you've tried to read Numbers ever, well, as the name suggests, it does contain a lot of numbers indeed, a lot of lists, statistics, and so on. If you're into your data analysis, Numbers is the book to go to for that for you. All sorts of numbers about the various Israelite tribes, which can make it sometimes about as tough to read as the phone book, really. It's not the easiest of books to go through. And yet, in between the neurological numbness that this numerical knowledge necessitates, there are numerous nuggets to notice. Not least the story of these five sisters by the name of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Let's say their names together, shall we, this morning? Are we ready? 1, 2, 3. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Excellent, excellent. Now, these 5 sisters, they lived in the years after Moses had led the Israelites in their escape from Egyptian slavery and out into the wilderness. And they belonged to one of the tribes of Israel, various clans of people who were journeying through the desert, waiting to enter the promised land that God had in store for them. And yet, while these 5, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, they may not be the famous 5, perhaps, of literature, I'd suggest they are up there with perhaps the most impactful, the most radical of women in the whole of history. And why might this be? Well, here's their story from the book of Numbers, chapter 27, when we're told this. It says, the daughters of Zelophehad, he was their dad, Zelophehad, were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they belonged to the clans of Manasseh. They came forward and stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the whole assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They said, our father died in the wilderness. He left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's brothers. So Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to him, what Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance to them. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites. So what's going on here? Well, I think for a start, it's worth noting that these were deeply patriarchal times controlled by men, usually to the detriment of women. And for example, the inheritance rules were such that when a head of a family clan, and the head was always male, died, his land would go to his sons. But if this clan head only had daughters, as was the case with Zelophehad, well, the custom was that this land wouldn't go to his daughters, but would instead be given to a different clan, one headed up by a man. And so as such, women in those days had very few, if any, property rights. Now, Zelophehad's daughters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, they were evidently unimpressed by this custom, to say the least. In fact, it felt so unjust that they decided to challenge the whole patriarchal system. Indeed, from what we know of how things were organised then, these 5 women would have had to leave the tented area reserved for women and make their way to the most sacred area of the whole camp, known as the tent of meeting, where Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the tribal leaders would have gathered. As you can imagine, for these 5 women, that would have taken some courage to step out in the first place, to step out of their allocated area into a male-dominated area. They would have been seen coming, and you can imagine perhaps what was going through their minds. What's more, they further defied the accepted customs by not only deciding to speak up as women in front of the whole assembly, but they came with a demand that the inheritance laws should be reformed so that women, and not just men, could inherit their father's land. They said this, as we heard. They said, our father died in the wilderness, he left no sons. Why should our father's name, our family name, disappear from this clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's brothers. And this is a proper history-defining moment here, a very early plea for gender equality in an otherwise male-dominated society. And Moses, to his credit, I think, well, we're told he listens to their case and no doubt taken a bit by surprise with their boldness. He agrees, not straight away, doesn't agree with them, but he says, I'm going to go away and I will prayerfully consider your proposal. And this is what we're told he felt God say to him. What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance to them. What's more, this is to have the force of law for the Israelites, and not just for these daughters, but for all families where there was only female heirs. I don't think we should underestimate how radical this decision was and what a victory for women's rights these 5 women achieved. They achieved it through their courage, their boldness, and their righteous sense of needing to rectify a gender-based injustice. Indeed, when the Israelites eventually entered the promised land of Israel, and the land was divided up among the different clans, the successor to Moses, a guy we know as Joshua, he honoured this new law, giving these women their own land alongside other male clan leaders. So in a book of Joshua, reread this. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah went to Joshua and the leaders and said, look, the Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance among our relatives. Again, they're bold in re-emphasizing their rights. So Joshua gave them an inheritance, along with the brothers of their father, according to the Lord's command. As I say, this was radical stuff. And the legacy of these women in challenging the patriarchy of their time continued to be felt, benefiting generations of women who came after them, including perhaps thousands of years later, the knock-on affects us as well here with women's rights to this day. And while gender inequality sadly remains an ongoing issue in many ways to this day, I think in these 5, in Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah, we see an example of the difference that can be made. Indeed, I'd suggest it's a combination of their courage to challenge injustice, but also the strength of their voices that made all the difference. You know, it's not an accident, I think, that there's 5 of them. There's strength in numbers here. One voice can sometimes struggle to be heard and may get lost, but having strength in numbers, 5 sisters standing in solidarity together, that seemed to be decisive. And I think for us, perhaps, the lesson in following the lead of these 5 immensely important but biblically quite obscure characters, I think the lesson is, I'd say, that part of what it means to be the people of God is that we're to challenge gender-based injustice, and indeed any injustice, wherever and whenever we see it. But what's more, when we are united in that challenge, when we draw on the strength and solidarity of those alongside us, well, that can shape not just the life of our church and our community, but as with these 5 sisters, who knows what legacy that willingness to challenge injustice might lead to for the generations to come who are to follow us. Amen.